The crew of Apollo 13 trained over and over and over and over and over again in simulations. They covered hundreds of scenarios. There were times they failed and there were times they succeeded. With each simulation, they evaluated, recalibrated, and tried again. I mentioned earlier the military does these reviews called after-action reviews, or AARs. When a mission is over, we would go over the mission and its directives. Then we would go over how the mission was carried out. And from here, we evaluated the outcome and began to ask questions. And the questions ranged from what worked and what didn't work, what we could have done better, or what we could have done more effective. And then we made the changes and we trained again. This is what the Apollo 13 crew did. They trained over and over and over and over and over to be astronauts. They were trained to be problem solvers in spaceships. And my dad was a pilot, and he actually used to say, when you fly an aircraft, its job is to try and kill you. And as a pilot, it's your job to train and problem solve so that it fails at every attempt. These men trained to accomplish the impossible task for the third time, learning from the previous expeditions of landing on the moon. However, when the number 2 tank blew and the power started draining, it was something no one had ever thought of. They hadn't trained for this scenario, but the truth of who they were didn't change. They trained to solve problems and solve them fast. They trained on how to use equipment. They knew where every bit of it was. They even developed plans that were written out. They trained to be astronauts. The situation didn't change any of that. That was their standing. That is who they were. They could have easily stayed in stacking mode, seeing negative after negative and giving up and feeling overwhelmed and all that stuff, but the truth of who they were and how they trained kicked in automatically. They had already done the work of being fully persuaded of the truth of who they were. And they'd introduced themselves as such all the time. It was who they were. They didn't know any other way to be. And so when things went south fast, their automatic response was the truth of who they were. And they attacked each problem from that place. Now, the youngest son had a similar mindset as the Apollo crew. He was his father's son. He was a citizen of the land of his father. He had voiced differently prior to leaving the pigs behind, and he did voice it to his father upon seeing him. However, if it wasn't something that was deeply embedded in him, he wouldn't have climbed out of the situation he'd put himself in. On his journey away from his home, he had money, which awarded him comfort. His mindset was easily protected by the wealth he had. His journey back home, he has nothing. Only the hopes that his father would accept him back as his son, even though he felt unworthy to be called as such. But why take step after step if he truly didn't believe he was still his father's son? I honestly don't think he struggled with the truth of who he was. I think he struggled between his state and standing. And by state, I mean the condition and the reputation of who he was at that point in time. His standing is the position within his family. Nothing would ever separate him from being his father's son. So again, the state is the condition or situation or reputation of who you are at that point in time. Your standing is who you are in relation to God and your family. Again, nothing will ever change that. However, because he had lost all his wealth given to him by his father, because he'd ended up homeless, hungry, and working with pigs, he'd felt tarnished. He'd felt he'd tarnished that reputation of his family and his father. He even voices that struggle when he says, "I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But I am convinced he knew deep down who he was. He was his father's son. And it was this that propelled him forward. This persuasion deep inside is what fought back every thought that told him he was an idiot loser and who didn't deserve anything else from his father.